In this video we go through the paranormal experiences of 5 different people. The stories are separated with this following sound. When our family dog died, I was in my early 20s, still living in the home where I was raised, a traditional Indian household nestled in the suburbs of London. As anyone who has ever loved a pet knows, its passing was devastating. But it also marked the single most chilling experience of my life. The night our dog passed away, my younger brother entered my bedroom around 2 a.m. and whispered, "Are you awake?" His tone alone jolted me upright. "Can you hear that?" Sleep vanished. My pulse quickened. I strained to listen, but the house was silent. "There. Can't you hear that?" he insisted, his voice laced with an unease that was rare for him. I must emphasize, my brother is a rational man. Unshakable, pragmatic, and staunchly opposed to anything that compromises one's grasp on reality. If he was disturbed, then something was wrong. "I can hear Dad outside calling me," he finally said. A chill ran down my spine. Still half asleep, I tried to rationalize. Maybe our father had sleepwalked or had somehow gotten locked out. But that made no sense, he had never done either. Together, we crept to my parents' room and peered into the darkness. "Dad?" I called quietly. Our father stirred, groggy and disoriented. Both of us staring at him in the dead of night was strange enough, but my brother's next words made the blood drain from my face. "Dad, I can hear you calling me." Now the whole house was awake. What followed might have been comical if it hadn't been so eerie. We all moved downstairs, my hand gripping a solid object in case there was an intruder lurking outside. Our garden was visible through massive sliding glass doors, and thanks to the ambient glow of the streetlights, the view was clear. Nothing. And yet, my brother whispered, "Can't you hear it?" His bewilderment had turned to something closer to dread. "What exactly do you hear?" my father asked. "You," my brother said simply. "Calling me from the garden." For a long moment, my father was silent. Then, something in his face shifted, recognition, sadness. He nodded slightly and peered into the darkness beyond the glass. "Everyone go to bed," he said firmly. "I will stay up a while." I thought the whole ordeal was silly at the time. I climbed the stairs and fell asleep without a second thought. The next morning, I came down for breakfast, still bemused by the previous night's events. My brother sat quietly, staring at the table. My father, however, was waiting for me. My father is Hindu, a man of faith who never forced his beliefs upon us. We, his London-born sons, had attended Roman Catholic schools, never questioning the boundaries between traditions. But that morning, he spoke with a gravity that made my stomach twist. He told us that in Hindu belief, when animals die, they do not immediately understand that they have passed on. Humans know when death takes them, and unless their souls have unfinished business, they move on. But pets? They only know one home. And when they find themselves outside, confused, they call to someone inside in a voice that will be recognized. They beg to be let in. Cold crept over me. My brother turned pale, his expression utterly blank. My father continued, his voice gentle. "I sat here last night, facing the garden, and I prayed for her. I told her to go in peace." My brother never spoke about it again. He never retracted what he had said, never tried to dismiss it as imagination. And neither did I. This story belongs to my sister. She is the reason I am utterly convinced that the paranormal is real. We'll call her Grace. Years ago, when Grace was in the 4th grade in California, she walked to the bus stop alone every morning. That is, until one day, she returned home wearing a strange, knowing smile. She walked up to our mother and asked a question that sent a cold chill through the room. "Mom, do you know a girl named Scotty?" My mother, mid-conversation on the phone, fell completely silent. Her face drained of color as she ended the call abruptly. "I'll call you back," she murmured, hands trembling. My siblings and I never had the chance to meet our real grandmother, our mother's mother. She had died in 1966, when our mother was only 7, her life stolen by kidney failure. Our mother rarely spoke about her, as if she had been erased. But we did know one thing: our mother had suffered cruelly for growing up without her. Her father remarried, twice, before settling with a woman we'll call Cindy. Cindy was different. A self-proclaimed witch. She refused to let anyone in the family speak of my mother's real mother. To us, Cindy was grandmother, and our grandfather was punished for even whispering about his first wife. And so, the woman known as Scotty had been all but lost to time. "Why are you asking about Scotty?" my mother finally managed to ask. Grace's answer sent a ripple of unease through us all. "She sometimes walks me to school. She tells me funny stories. She says she misses you and Grandpa a lot. Oh, and Gary is safe." Gary. Our uncle. Another name never spoken, never shared with Grace. He had died years before she was born, his past shadowed in secrecy. Our mother's hands clutched the kitchen counter for support. She grilled Grace, interrogated every friend, every teacher, every family member, desperate to find out who had told her these things. But no one had. No one could have. The visits from Scotty continued for some time, until they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Then we moved to New Hampshire. New England is old. Haunted. Our new town had been standing for over 250 years, its graveyards brimming with crumbling tombstones and secrets buried deep beneath the soil. And it was there, among the dead, that my sister found her sanctuary. She was drawn to cemeteries in a way that defied logic. Hours would pass as she sat atop graves, staring at their weathered names, whispering into the wind. "What do you do there?" I once asked her, uneasy with the sight of my little sister perched among the dead. "I talk to the ones who float," she replied, voice as casual as if she were discussing schoolwork. "Some of them are strict. But most are nice." It became her secret world, her hidden ritual. She snuck out under the moonlight, claiming to be at a friend's house. The friend was always 6 feet under. I followed her sometimes. Not because I wanted to, but because something told me she shouldn't be alone. I never saw what she saw. I never heard what she heard. But I believed her. Then came the night my grandfather lay dying. His body, frail and failing, clung to life in a hospital bed as we gathered to say our goodbyes. Machines beeped a hollow, mechanical rhythm. The air was thick with the weight of impending death. Grace stepped forward, brushing her fingers through his wispy gray hair. And then she began to speak. "Ernie is here," she whispered, eyes scanning the room as if watching unseen figures move among us. "He's waiting with a beer for you. Marvin is here, too. He says he can't wait to see you again." A gasp. Cindy's face twisted in horror. Ernie. Marvin. Names that had faded into obscurity, long dead before my sister was born. My mother's face turned white as bone. "Oh, and Scotty is waiting for you, Grandpa," Grace said sweetly, turning to my mother with a beaming smile. "Grandma Scotty says she always loved you, Mom. She says you did a good job raising your kids." Cindy fled the room. "I don't need proof anymore. I don't need stories. I know my sister is a medium. I know she speaks to the dead. And I know they speak back." One of my closest childhood friends, let's call him Paul, lived in a house that was, beyond a reasonable doubt, haunted. Not the kind of, "oh, maybe the house creaks," haunted. This was something else. The house was over a century old, a relic in a woodsy suburb, standing like a tombstone among the trees. Everyone who stepped inside that house for long enough had an experience. Every member of Paul's family. Several of our friends. Myself included. It wasn't just one event, one eerie moment, it was a series of things, piling up over the years, like the house was trying to warn us. Or worse, trying to break us. The whisper that woke me. When I was in high school, my parents went on vacation, so I stayed at Paul's house for a few days. I crashed on his bedroom floor in a sleeping bag while he slept soundly in his bed. One morning, before the sun had even fully risen, I woke up to someone, whispering in my ear. A breath, warm and urgent, so close it made my skin crawl. "You need to leave. Now." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. My eyes shot open. I immediately assumed Paul was messing with me, he was a prankster, after all. But as I turned to my right to glare at him, I saw him still asleep, breathing evenly, completely unaware. I swallowed hard. Then it hit me. I heard the whisper in my left ear. Paul was on my right side. The demon in the fan. Paul suffered from sleep paralysis constantly in that house. But it wasn't just paralysis, he saw things. A demon in the closet. A shadow standing over his bed. And worst of all, the standing fan next to his bed would morph into a girl, a grinning, twisted thing that watched him until he woke up with a jolt of adrenaline, punching or throwing the fan to the ground. It got to the point where he could barely sleep. Then he moved out. And just like that, his sleep paralysis stopped. The boy in the closet. The second floor, where Paul, his parents, and two of his sisters slept, was different. It always felt different. His sister claimed she saw the ghost of a little boy in their bathroom. His mother, who never believed in ghosts, once opened her closet and found the same little boy standing inside it. She froze. He looked up at her and whispered, "Where's my mom?" She slammed the door shut and never spoke of it again. The screaming house. One summer, Paul and his family left town for their yearly trip, leaving their two dogs behind. A friend of ours volunteered to feed them while they were gone. She arrived at sunset. The house was silent. She poured food into their bowls near the kitchen and stood there for a moment, scrolling through her phone, listening to the quiet. Then, a scream. A blood-curdling, human shriek, ripping through the silence from the living room. She froze, her blood running cold. Someone was inside the house with her. She grabbed the dogs and bolted outside. She checked for intruders. Locked every door. Peered through every window. Nothing. No one. Later, when she told Paul about it, he only laughed and said, "Yeah, shit like that happens sometimes." The woman in the window. Paul threw a lot of parties back then, and we usually stayed in the basement to avoid noise complaints. One night, one of our friends, one of the biggest skeptics in the group, ran upstairs to grab another drink. The house was completely empty aside from us in the basement. He stepped into the dining room, reached for his drink, then froze. A woman stood on the porch outside the window. Tall. Motionless. Staring directly at him. Something about her was wrong. Her face was blurred, her presence unnatural, like she had stepped out of a dream. He blinked. She was gone. He didn't believe in ghosts before that night. He did after. When he told Paul what happened, Paul just shrugged. Yeah, we've all seen her. The music box that played itself. The basement was the worst part of the house. It was meant for storage, but we used it for parties. Whole sections of it were completely cut off, buried under junk no one had touched in years. One summer, Paul's family decided to clear it out. I came by to help. Paul's dad grinned at me. You get to see the secret room, he said. Tucked away in the farthest corner, behind mountains of clutter, was a door. Inside was a tiny, forgotten storage closet. Old, dusty relics filled the space, things even Paul's parents didn't recognize. And among them, sitting on a shelf, was a music box. The kind with a delicate little ballerina, frozen in time. None of us wanted to touch it. Days later, when Paul and another friend were cleaning the basement alone, the air grew heavy. Then, from behind the closet door, the music box started playing. They hadn't touched it. Hadn't wound it. Hadn't even opened the closet all day. They bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind them. The exorcism dream. Paul's second oldest sister had a nightmare once. A vivid nightmare. In the dream, she was being exorcised. Priests stood over her, screaming Latin verses as she convulsed, clawing at her skin, a dark force ripping itself from her body. She woke up screaming. At that exact moment, the rosary that had been hanging on her wall flew across the room. It shattered on impact. She lay there, covered in sweat, heart pounding, staring at the broken pieces on the floor. She never hung another rosary in that house again. That house wanted us to know we weren't welcome. Some things we could explain away. Others, we could force ourselves to forget. But deep down, we all knew. Something else lived there. And it never left. I've changed some details in this story, because the people it would directly affect are still alive, and I don't want to bring them any more pain. But the truth remains. I grew up believing in nothing beyond what I could see, touch, or rationally explain. Ghost stories were for children, and the supernatural was just another fairy tale for the weak-minded. At least, that's what I told myself. Then I took a job working security at an ancient, decaying bar in the bad part of town. A real shithole. The kind of place that had soaked in generations of violence, regret, and something else, something worse. My job was simple: stand at the door, make sure no one got too rowdy, and help the bartenders close up at the end of the night. Most shifts were uneventful, just me fighting sleep while drunk staggered through the door. The bar had a second-floor office in what used to be an apartment, but no one had lived there for at least 50 years. Strange noises were common: banging upstairs, the sound of movement in empty rooms, voices that never belonged to any patron. We all heard them. Amy, the bartender, refused to go upstairs alone after dark. I always dismissed it, until the night something moved in the stairwell ahead of us. A shadow, formless and wrong, slid across the landing, something shifting in the darkness, something watching. Amy backed into me with a strangled squeak, her whole body trembling. It was just a shadow. Just a trick of the light. That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. I kept working there, because the alternative was admitting that I was afraid. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late fall, just after midnight. The streets were slick from a recent rain, the bar nearly empty. I stood by the front door, fighting off exhaustion, watching the street through the tall vertical window beside me. A man got up from the bar, someone I'd barely noticed before. Not a regular, but something about him stuck in my mind. His white cowboy hat, the gold pin glinting under the bar lights. His eyes were a striking gray, alive with some kind of inner joy. He seemed like the kind of guy you could sit down and have a real conversation with. I gave him a silent nod as he stepped outside. Maybe if I'd said something, anything, his fate would have been different. Maybe not. The sound came less than a minute later. A dull, wet thud, like a sack of meat hitting pavement. A momentary screech of tires. My stomach twisted. I pushed through the door and stepped onto the damp sidewalk. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The tail lights of a white pickup truck faded in the distance, running a red light as it disappeared. Then I saw the hat. It sat perfectly upright in the middle of the intersection, its brim barely disturbed. And then I saw him. Sprawled on his back, his face cut, his chest rising and falling in uneven, wheezing gasps. I shouted for Amy to call 911 and ran to him, trying to remember my first aid training. His stomach felt unnaturally firm, as if something inside him had already begun to harden. Blood seeped out between his legs, pooling onto the pavement. I told him to stay still. He was trembling. His fingers curled inward, spasming, like a child reaching for something just out of grasp. I took his hand. His breath hitched. And then his whole body froze. His gray eyes, so full of life minutes before, rolled wildly, the right one flooding with red as a hemorrhage spread across the sclera. But it wasn't pain on his face. It wasn't confusion. It was horror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. A silent scream spread his lips, his whole body locking up with the raw, unfiltered terror of something only he could see. And then, in a whispering, gasping voice, he pleaded. "Don't let them take me, don't let them have me, don't let them take me, don't let them have me." Over and over. My breath hitched. The air behind me felt thick, electric, occupied. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. He held on to my hand like I was the last thread keeping him tethered to this world. I could feel his fear, the primal panic of something there, something closing in. I wanted to look behind me. I couldn't. It took him several agonizing minutes to die. And the whole time, his red-rimmed, blood-flooded eyes never wavered, locked in a silent, wordless scream at something beyond me. Then his body went still. The thing that had been waiting, took him. The fire department arrived, then the police. No one tried CPR. No heroic movie-style resuscitations. They knew a corpse when they saw one. I gave a statement, but I left out what he said. Left out how he looked. Left out the fact that I could still feel something watching. It was just a hit and run. Just another tragic accident in a city that doesn't stop moving. A few days later, the man's sister came to the bar, asking for me. I don't know what she wanted. I never called her back. Shortly after that, I quit. But I still see him. Some nights, I wake up, and he's there, in my mind's eye, staring, pleading, his mouth forming words I can't hear but know by heart. And sometimes, just for a moment, I feel the air behind me go still. Like something is waiting. When I was 9, my family moved into a brand new house in the suburbs just outside Toronto. Fresh paint, new carpet, untouched walls, nothing about it should have been haunted. But I was never alone there. My bedroom was a perfect square, my bed centered against the wall across from the door. To the right, a large window. To the left, my dresser with its towering mirror. The hallway outside had its own window, with a balcony across from my door, and my parents' and sister's rooms to the right. I remember the first time I saw her. It was a summer morning. I was getting dressed, staring absently at my reflection in the mirror. Through the glass, I could see the hallway window perfectly, and in front of it, a woman. She stood motionless, her long black hair falling over her shoulders as she gazed outside. Thinking it was my mom, I chirped, "Good morning, Mom," as any happy-go-lucky 9-year-old would. She didn't respond. A strange feeling prickled up my arms as I turned my head toward the doorway. The hallway was empty. I frowned. Maybe she had just walked into her room or my sister's. I called out down the hall. Nothing. I called again. Nothing. Finally, I leaned over the railing and called downstairs. My mom's voice drifted up from the basement, 2 floors below me. She had been there the whole time. Years passed, and the house only grew darker. I was around 11 or 12 when my little sister, just a toddler at the time, started talking to imaginary friends. I didn't think much of it. Kids do that, right? One afternoon, my grandparents were babysitting. My grandma put my sister down for a nap in her bedroom, directly above the living room, then came downstairs to watch TV with me and my grandpa. Then we heard it. Soft pitter-patter footsteps, running across the floor above our heads. We assumed my sister had woken up and was playing around. The footsteps would stop for a moment, then start up again. After a few minutes, my grandma had enough. She wanted to catch my sister in the act, so she snuck upstairs, making sure she'd hear her running around before opening the door. She swears that even as she reached the top step, she still heard the footsteps. But when she opened the door, my sister was fast asleep. Passed out, completely still, her chest rising and falling in deep, slow breaths. The footsteps stopped the second my grandma opened the door. I stared at the ceiling, the silence pressing against my ears. I didn't say anything, but deep inside, I knew. It wasn't my sister who had been running around. A few months later, I was hanging out in my room, playing guitar with a friend. We were laughing, messing around, until my bedroom door suddenly slammed shut. It wasn't a gentle close. It was violent. We both jumped, the sound still ringing in my ears. But we weren't too freaked out yet. It was summer, so maybe a window was open somewhere. But before we could even get up, the door swung back open. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. This door didn't just swing open. The knob had to twist for it to open. It wasn't possible for air pressure to move it. The blood drained from my friend's face. We ran. After that, I started seeing things. Dark shapes in my peripheral vision. A shadow standing at the top of the stairs, just watching. The flicker of a figure disappearing down the hallway whenever I turned my head. It never wanted me to see it fully, but I knew it was there. And then there was the basement. I hated it. More than anywhere else in that house, the basement felt wrong. Not just that someone was watching, but that something didn't want me there. My dog refused to go downstairs. If we carried her down, she'd claw and fight her way back up. The day we moved out, my parents sent me down to grab the last of our things. I still remember standing at the bottom of the steps, staring into the dimly lit basement, feeling like I had seconds before something reached out from the shadows and grabbed me. I grabbed what I needed and ran up the stairs, 2 at a time, not looking back. I don't know what would have happened if I had. There were more things. My sister's dolls moving from where we left them. The whispers. The nights where I woke up knowing something was in the room with me. To this day, my family believes the shadowy figure in the hallway was my great-grandmother, watching over us. We never saw her until we hung up her picture in the house, and ever since, she has followed us to every home we've lived in. That figure doesn't feel bad. If anything, it's comforting. But whatever else was in that house, that was something else entirely. I still don't know what was haunting that place. It was a brand new home, with no history of tragedy. But maybe the land itself was cursed. Maybe something had been waiting there long before the foundation was poured. All I know is, that house never felt like home.